Hey, what's up? This is Soul Pillars, and in this production walkthrough, we're going to be looking at side chaining, various ways that you can do it, and a few creative uses as well. The creative uses are going to be a little bit plugin dependent, but this video is kind of aimed at the way I like to use side chaining. The video is going to be in FL Studio, but the concepts are easily translatable to any other DAW. Fruity Loops does require a little bit of routing to set up side chains, whereas in Ableton it's a little bit more simple. But yeah, let's jump into this and look at a few ways that you can actually implement a side chain. We've got a piano loop here and a few drum hits, and then later on in the video I'm going to be showing you a finished project and how I used side chaining technique in that project. Sweet. Cool, so firstly, why would you want to use a side chain? I think the most simple explanation is because you don't want your frequencies to be clashing from different instruments. For example, I think the most common example is your kick and your bass. They both occupy the same areas in the frequency spectrum, and what a side chain will do is allow your kick to cut through the bass by reducing the gain or compressing the bass whenever the kick hits. So this is useful especially for drums, but it's not only limited to drums. So the first way that you can go about side chaining is using a ghost hit, right? So here I have a piano loop, then I have my kick over here and my snare over here. Over my kick and my snare, I have implemented these tiny little transient hits. So for this method, you're going to be wanting samples that are pretty much just clicks, like extremely short sample hits. And you're going to place them over your other hits. So wherever I have a kick hit, I've placed a kick side chain hit. What is important to note about these side chain hits, these little transient hits, that I've routed them in FL to track 1 and track 2, but they are not routed to the master channel, right? So in effect, their audio is not going to be coming out of the master channel. That's why they ghost hits. They are going to be used to trigger the side chain whenever the kick and the snare hit. This is what that sounds like. So this instance of Fruity Limiter has got the kick side chain, and this one has the snare side chain. You can see very graphically how the side chain is actually affecting the piano atmosphere, right? So if we turn these off, and now on, we can make the settings a little bit more extreme to really push through that side chaining idea. I'm just increasing the release of the compressor here. So the piano roll or the piano loop is ducking each time the kick and the snare hit. So why would you use these ghost hits instead of just the actual kick and the snare? The reason is that you have a lot more control over the parameters of the ducking effect when you're using extremely short transients. So with any compressor, Fruity Limiter, we've got it set to the compressor setting. You have these controls for threshold, knee, ratio, attack and release. So if you are just using a kick hit, especially if it's got a long tail, you are going to be quite limited in how short or how long you can make that side chain. Although when you are using this ghost hit, this very short transient hit, you're able to tailor the length of the side chain using the release very, very precisely. So we can start it out with the release all the way to 0 and then bring it up. Do the same with the snare. this method is quite powerful. And again, you can use this not only on drums. Say, for example, we wanted to create some sort of sidechain rhythm within a pad or an atmosphere like this piano loop. So I'm just going to use the kick sidechain for this. We can drag in a drum loop. So what I'm going to do now is just throw these sidechain ghost hits wherever I want to kind of emulate this break. Cool, so we're going to loop this and make the kick sidechain a little bit slower, a little bit faster on the release, and see what we have come up with. So you can see how we've kind of copied the pattern of this drum loop with this ghost sidechain, and now we're getting some sort of rhythmic element out of a pad or a melody. You can turn the drums on so you can hear it with the drums. And with the drums off. So this method gives you a lot more freedom in terms of where you want your ducking effect to happen. If we just had to sidechain this break to the atmosphere, we would get ducking at every single hit. And we may not want this if we want to accentuate some sort of groove. The second method I'm going to show you is just using the actual kick and snare samples as the sidechain triggers. So in FL Studio, I'm going to go through the routing process that you would take. So I've got my kick, my snare on channels or tracks 3 and 4, and I have gone and sidechained them to the atmosphere bus. So I want my sidechain not only to be affecting the individual piano, but also all sounds that may end up in that bus that I've created for my atmospheres and melodies. So in FL Studio, you're going to click on your channel, your kick. You're going to right click on the place that you want to sidechain it to and say sidechain to this track. Exactly the same with the snare. And in my atmosphere bus, I'm going to be using these compressors to trigger a sidechain or to compress the signal when the sidechain is triggered. In FL Studio, you're going to click this little cog. You're going to go to the VST wrapper settings. You're going to go to processing and your stereo sidechain in. We're going to set to 1, 2, 3 because I know that this kick ghost sidechain and the snare ghost sidechain are already sidechained to this atmosphere bus. So the third signal that is being sidechained to the atmosphere bus is my kick. Hence, we use number 3 as the stereo sidechain input. And for our snare sidechain, we are going to do the same thing. Yeah, Ableton is a little bit more simple, but once you get the hang of it, it's not that bad. I generally like to use 2 separate compressors or limiters to sidechain my kick and my snare instead of grouping my kick and my snare to one sidechain. This just gives me a little bit more freedom over the frequencies that I want to be ducking, which we'll get to in the next technique. We're going to set the sidechain input to external for both of these plugin instances. And now we can make the compressor settings a little bit more extreme. Set the release a bit longer for the kick and the attack straight away. Same with the snare. You'll notice now that we are slightly more limited in terms of how we can shape the sidechaining envelope because the sidechain is going to be taking into account this entire signal. Same with the snare, this entire signal and the tail. So a very powerful method that you can use for sidechaining is multi-band compression. I'm going to be using Pro MB by FabFilter. This plugin is very CPU intensive, but it highlights this sidechaining technique very well. So I've got my kick routed to this instance of Pro MB and my snare routed to this instance of Pro MB. And both of these instances of Pro MB are going to be on the atmosphere bus. And again, the kick and the snare on channel 3 and 4 are being side chained to the atmosphere bus. We've got our side chain set to external mode as well, so that the sidechain signal is not going to be the atmosphere itself, it's going to be the external signal, which is the kick. So Pro MB, we're going to create a band, boom, and to external. The reason you would use multi-band compression to sidechain is if you want to sidechain and duck specific frequencies of a sound. You don't want the entire signal, such as the piano in this case, to be dropping. You want maybe only the sub-frequencies to be ducking while leaving the mid and high frequencies intact, so that the pumping effect, this kind of effect, that real like drop in volume is not so accentuated. Sometimes you don't want that. Sometimes you want it to be a little more subtle. In this instance, I would want to sidechain the sub-frequencies of the kick to the sub-frequencies in this, the lower mid frequencies in this piano pad, or this piano sample, because that's where the kick and the piano are going to be clashing the most, in those low mid frequencies. So I can even make it a little bit more specific around these low mid frequencies. So you can see here our kick is only influencing, only compressing the mid frequencies in this piano sample, leaving the highs untouched. We could if we wanted to, but I think the most important part for these two sounds is this low mid area. And then we can activate our snare sidechain as well. And generally, I don't want to be sidechaining my snare too much below the frequencies that it occupies. So my snare is going to be taking up these frequencies, kind of around 800 hertz upwards. So we can make the piano sample only duck from those frequencies around 800 hertz upwards. Now, in more aggressive styles of bass music, generally your snare is going to be having a little bit more low frequency content, and you can get a lot more energy and a lot more punch from your snare from actually just sidechaining frequencies a little bit lower. One extremely powerful feature of Pro MB is this little slider down here. This is going to be the stereo link slider. If we want the mid frequencies or the side frequencies to be sidechained, this is going to tie into a video I'll do later on mid side and sort of stereo information. But this is quite powerful for carving out space in your mix where you don't want to use an EQ, because an EQ is going to be quite permanent if you want a mid-side EQ, but mid-side compression is going to be a lot more dynamic. So we could set this kick to only sidechain the mid frequencies of the piano. And this is going to push our piano a little bit wider because the mid frequencies are now being taken away. There is an illusion that the sound is kind of being pushed open and pushed a little bit forward in the mix as well. Conversely, we can click this button to side, and now the kick is only going to be sidechaining the side frequencies, leaving the mid frequencies untouched. And this is going to have the opposite effect, kind of pushing the sound a little bit back in the mix and also pushing the sound a little bit closer to the center of the mix. Back to mid. These tools are quite powerful. I'd suggest maybe if you have some good speakers, stereo speakers or a set of headphones, you'll be able to hear the effect a lot more clearly. But yeah, this is a very cool mixing tool, and you can be quite creative with it as well. On to the next one. For the last method I'm going to show you is using envelope followers as sidechaining tools. So I've got Duck here. There are envelope followers with a lot more capabilities, but I just wanted something to sidechain with, and this does the job perfectly well. So I've set up the routing. My kick is routed to this instance of Duck. My snare is routed to this instance of Duck. And both instances of Duck are going to be on the atmosphere bus, with my kick and my snare sidechained to the atmosphere bus. I've set up the routing. I'm using the sidechain input as the trigger mode. And now we have complete freedom in terms of how long we want our sidechain to be. This is a little bit akin to the ghost sample version that I showed you in step number 1, but we don't have to place ghost notes or ghost samples over every single hit. We're just using our kick and our snare sample for this, and here we have some more freedom to be able to tailor how long or how short or like the shape of our sidechain. So with this shape, we don't really have any sidechain going on, and as I bring the slope down, the sidechain effect will become more noticeable. What I really like about Duck as well is that we have some multi-band features. So we can turn on this crossover knob here. So at this crossover point we'll set it to 400 Hertz. Everything below 400 Hertz is going to be considered part of the lows, and everything above 400 Hertz or 420 Hertz nearly is going to be considered part of the highs. And now using these two knobs, we can select how much we want the lows to be sidechained and how much we want the highs to be sidechained, which is very, very useful for mixing purposes. So with this sound, I want everything below 400 Hertz to be very heavily sidechained by the kick, but everything above 400 Hertz doesn't have to be affected so much by the kick. And we can turn the snare sidechain on now as well. Kick, snare. I know that the snare is occupying frequencies from 800 Hertz upwards, so I'm going to set this crossover point to around 800, 700 Hertz and reduce the low sidechaining by quite a bit and keep the highs very sidechained. This is a very nice, very easy way of doing sidechains, and you have a lot of control over specific parameters, which is ideally what you want. Cool, so let's move on to some creative applications of sidechaining and ways that I like to use sidechaining. So far, we've looked at how we can use drums to sidechain other elements, such as a bass, or in this case, a piano melody section. The way we've looked at sidechains now is how we can make elements cut through other elements, but there are some other ways to use sidechains, which we will look at now. The first very powerful way that we can use sidechaining is if we have two elements which are occupying the same frequency spectrum, but we kind of want to differentiate them in the mix. Obviously, we can go through and use EQs and stuff like that, which is what we are going to do. But sidechaining in this instance is going to give us a shortcut to doing that. So we are going to be using FabFilter Pro Q3 for this. And we have two elements which, yeah, are taking up the same space. One is more stereo than the other, so that is giving them a bit of separation, but we want to kind of differentiate them a little bit more. So I am going to sidechain track 24 to track 23. I'm going to sidechain the lead, or this darker green over here, to the atmosphere up here. So we're going to go down here and right click and sidechain to this track. So we have got our instance of ProQ3 on the track that is receiving the sidechain information. I'm going to go up here and set up the correct routing. Processes stereo sidechain 1. And down here, I'm going to select the sidechain spectrum so we can see what is coming into this plugin. So this red outline that you're seeing is going to actually be the signal from this lead over here, this sound. And if I have to turn that sound off to hear the more pad element, you'll see that on the EQ too. So now we have both of these sounds coming into the same EQ. And FabFilter Pro Q3 has this awesome feature called EQ Match. It's pretty much going to give us a whole bunch of EQ points that try and match this signal to the sidechain signal that it's receiving. So pretty much what we have now is FabFilter has gone through and set up all of these EQ points to try and get our atmospheric sound, which is this sound, to sound similar to this sound. And this is what we have come out with. This is useful if you want to get two sounds to sound the same, but what we can do is select all of these EQ points and maybe get rid of some of the more exacerbated EQs like this shelf and maybe this shelf up here. And we can select them and just invert the gain, so getting the opposite effect. So what this is going to do is accentuate the differences between the two sounds and pretty much EQing this top sound in the complete opposite way that this sound has been EQ'd. And take this a step further by copying over this EQ and reversing the EQs yet again. So we have used a sidechain to try and differentiate two sounds that may otherwise sound very similar in the mix. Another very cool way we can use sidechaining is with the simple use of a gate. Now this is something I did learn from Command Sound and have experimented with a little bit since, but it is not a secret technique. I do think it is overlooked, though something so simple as a gate can have such a powerful effect. This is kind of akin to the ghost samples that we used in the first clip. So again, I have these two elements. And let me just turn the gate off. But if we wanted to add some interesting effects, some interesting rhythmic effects to these pads, these stabs, we could use a gate. So I have this hat sample over here, which I'm going to root. There's some cool rhythmic elements going on here, but for this method, I do not want this sound to be coming out of the master. So I'm going to unlink it from the drum bus or unlink it from the master. And I've set up a side chain to the atmosphere bus where both of these samples are going to be coming through, where both of these samples are routed to. I'm going to use Pro G, but you can use any gate that will accept a side chain. I've set up the routing correctly. I've set the sidechain input to external so that this hat sample triggers the sidechain, and we can see what comes out. So what is happening here is that the gate is only letting audio through whenever one of these hat samples is playing. So in effect, we are getting these pads and these stabs to follow the rhythm that the hats are playing. And we can make this effect as intense or as subtle as we would like with the attack and release controls. If we make the release very, very short and the attack very short and the hold very short as well, we get an extremely staccato effect. And we can use the threshold setting to kind of only get the tips of the hat, the loudest peaks, or we can bring the threshold setting down if we want more of the hat sounds to be triggering the sidechain. We can make this a little bit smoother by increasing the release and increasing the hold time. Now, if I route the hat sample to come out of the master as well, this is what it's going to sound like. So we have pretty much, using a sidechain, created a rhythm out of a pad or a stab, which can be quite difficult to do manually if you want to chop up each of these slices of the pad to manually, kind of like map to each of these hits. And in doing this kind of manual method, we're not going to be getting something that sounds as natural and sounds as coherent, Let's turn off the gate. It's going to be a little bit more choppy, but with the use of a gate, there is a very natural sort of flow and a natural sort of communication between the hat, which we are using as the sidechain trigger, and the pads. So this is really cool if you want your atmospheric or more drawn out elements to kind of get some sort of groove. And I think this is a really wicked way to use sidechaining. So we're in Glory, the Glory project, the remix that I did for Repulse and Son of Dodd again. And we're going to look at another creative use of sidechains. And this is going to be primarily focused on the groove and how you can use sidechains of your drums, the more standard way of using a sidechain to accentuate groove, because at the end of the day, that is what I use a sidechain for the most. It is to get the drums cutting through the mix, but not only that, to create the groove and the push and the pull, because when the kick is hitting and the sub is going away, the rate at which the sub returns into the mix is going to affect the feel of the tune. Using sidechains to create groove is, I think, one of the most useful implementations of a sidechain. And in this tune, I have set up all of my tracks, all of my groups, right? So I've got my drum group over here, I've got my bass group over here, I've got my atmospheres, the rises, the FX, and the vocals. All of these groups are being routed to a single bus. So everything except the drums is going to one bus. And on that bus, I have implemented a kick and a snare sidechain. So in effect, my kick and my snare are going to be side chained to every single thing in the tune except for themselves and some other percussion, right? And I find that this method, I learned this from Mr. Bill, gives your side chains a lot more coherency, so you're not having to make a specific side chain for each sound. And it also really just throws your kick and your snare through the entire mix, you know what I mean? Like, everything else is going to be ducking to those hits, and that can give your drums a lot of power and a lot of weight. In this instance, in this project, we have a lot of these mid-bass shots, which I will solo for you. Sorry, my CPU is eating shit. And now, these hits are being sidechained by the kick and the snare. If I turn on the kick and the snare, currently the sidechain is off, so things are sounding quite messy. The mid-bass shots are interfering with the kick and the snare. Now, if I turn the kick and the snare sidechain on, this is what we get. It's not too noticeable, but immediately the kick and the snare are more clear, they're more coherent, and they're cutting through those mid-bass hits. The placement of these mid-bass shots is going to influence the groove a lot, because with these kick and snare envelopes, you can see they're quite harsh. So, section over here. So we have this sample on each snare hit, or on every second snare hit. So it is quite a stagnant sound. There's not a lot of dynamic sort of volume stuff going on there. Now layering the side chain of the snare on top of that, this is what we get. So now with the side chain turned on of the snare, this sound has a little bit more dynamic. Yeah, there's some more dynamic range going on here. It's coming from softer when the snare hits to louder when the snare ends, creating this like false tail behind the snare. And the kick is also doing the same thing here. If I turn the kick on, and again, at this section, I've done the exact same thing with the placement of this mid-bass hit. And altering the length of this mid-bass hit, as you can see here. The first hit is the longest, second hit is a little bit shorter, and the third hit is very short. And these are all working as sort of false tails to the actual snare. So this is without those mid-bass hits. And this is with those mid-bass shots. If I turn the vocals off, you can hear it a little bit more. These mid-bass shots here are just adding some more dimension to the drum hits and are filling the spaces right after the snare is done. And these mid-bass shots are kind of just filling the space in between all of that. So that is one way of using your sidechain drums to affect the groove of samples. And now placement is going to be really important with this technique, because obviously the drums are sidechained quite heavily to everything in the track. So naturally those side chains are going to be cutting out some audio. They're going to be taking detail out of the sounds that you have chosen. So the placement of your samples is going to be essential if you're going to be using very heavy side chaining like this. And I think that is overlooked, or it was something that I overlooked for a long time, is that simple notion of where am I going to put my samples? Am I going to put my samples in places where there's not a lot going on? Or am I going to try and cram all these samples on top of each other? And you're going to achieve a cleaner mix if you are very conscious about where you place your samples. Like, for instance, these bass hits are placed in a part of the song where the only thing that is going on is the sub bass and this hit. So there's only, at this one point in the tune, there are only two sounds playing. Going back to the sort of gating method that I talked about previously, the vocals in this section of the tune are side-chained to the snare using, you guessed it, a gate. So instead of putting a gate on the entire bus, I just wanted this vocal sample to be affected by the gate. This is what that vocal sample sounds like. So what I have done is sidechain the snare to this gate so that this sample only plays when the snare hits, giving a more rhythmic element to this vocal sample. You can hear that the sound is not going away completely when the snare goes away. And that is because I have mixed in some of the dry signal of the vocal chop. But I managed to get some really cool articulations of this vocal sample saying glory. Again, just by the different placement of the sample. Yeah. Again over here. And the last one. So we've got these different articulations. There were different sort of vowel sounds. Maybe it was the Y at the end of glory. Maybe it was the gl at the beginning of the glory being emphasized by the snare. Yeah, these are some of the ways that I like to use side chaining to accentuate groove, to be creative with gates, to figure out which frequencies need to be adjusted or changed with an EQ to make two tracks sit nicely together. And I hope you learned something new. A lot of these techniques were learned through Koan Sound as well as YouTube, and obviously me just kind of messing around and figuring out ways to apply these techniques to my tunes. So I'll see you in the next video. We're going to be looking at mid-side. We're going to be looking at how to make things wider and a few of the processes I like to use to get shit to like be way out here. Sweet. Check you on the next one.